There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. This is the second half of a two-parter about former Michigan Police Chief Laura Frizzo. If you haven't heard part one, please go back and listen, and then come back to listen to part two. Chris Regan, a 53-year-old war veteran and father of two sons, hadn't been seen since October the 14th, 2014. Weeks turned into months, and as the lakes of Michigan's Upper Peninsula turned to ice, there was still no sign of him. Inside Chris's car, police had found one item of interest: a handwritten note that appeared to be directions. At first, it hadn't made any sense. But once police looked more closely, it became clear they were directions to the home of Kelly Cochran, a colleague who Chris was having a relationship with. Kelly was fair, with brown hair, hazel eyes and a number of tattoos, most of them of butterflies. She was physically strong and taller than most women, standing at about 5 feet 10 inches. Kelly worked at a factory that manufactured parts for naval ships, which is where she'd met Chris, 20 years her senior. According to Kelly, her husband Jason Cochran was aware of her affair with Chris. Her affairs were simply part of their marriage. She'd seen Chris a few days before he disappeared, but she didn't know where he'd gone or why he'd left. But police knew this wasn't true. Kelly knew far more than she was letting on, and they were beginning to suspect so too did her husband Jason. The evidence was stacking up pretty quickly, and eventually the team managed to reverse track Chris's GPS, so the thing in his car that gave some insight into where he'd been, and they were able to trace his last known whereabouts. What did they discover?
Well, this is some of the evidence that the FBI had taken from me. I worked with the Michigan State Police, and then eventually I worked with the FBI. And the FBI took a lot of my evidence to Quantico, and that was my biggest desire. Well, one of them. My first one was I wanted Jason's cell phone, reverse engineered so we could try and see what was on it, because that phone was used to contact Chris Regan's phone, and those were the last phone conversations that he had was with Jason Cochran's cell phone, which, again, I believe Kelly was definitely setting up her own husband just in case things went down and were discovered where she could place the blame on Jason. But at any rate, the cell phone was one of the items, and the GPS for the vehicle, of course, was a big one. Initially, I had contacted the maker of the GPS itself, and there was no software out yet to reverse engineer this GPS. It was a brand new car, and so the FBI was having a very difficult time doing it as well. We actually didn't get the results from that GPS until after Kelly Cochran was in jail, after she had confessed, so to speak. But that GPS did show that Chris Regan was at their residence. His vehicle was there October 14th, and then it showed it going to the park and ride. And that was really important because initially, of course, Kelly's claim was the last time I saw Chris was maybe around the 14th or 15th of October. And I went to his place and I brought him lasagna. So her claim was, that was the last time she saw him. That was the last place she saw him. I believed from the get-go that he had gone to her place. So, of course, the results did end up proving that he did go there. There were other things, too, that were proven after the fact that I'm glad, at least I know that if she hadn't confessed, we would have eventually got her. I do believe we would have had enough to charge her, but it would have been a lot further down the road.
On February the 20th, 2016, a 911 call comes in from Kelly. What does she tell the operator?
She asked for an ambulance, and she told the operator that her husband wasn't breathing, or he was breathing barely. And basically, they asked some questions. She had him sitting up. She's trying to describe, what his composure is. And it's all an act, obviously. Paramedics arrive, and Kelly was in their way. She was uncooperative. She's causing a problem. So they just needed to get him out of there so they could actually try to work on him, but he was already deceased.
And when they performed an autopsy on him after the fact, what did they determine in terms of his cause of death?
Well, he did have fatal amounts of heroin and fentanyl in his system, but that is not what killed him. I think that she thought that's what it was going to show. And it honestly probably would have been what his death was labeled as if it weren't for, us working this case and being on top of her, because one of the detectives did go to the autopsy and did inform the pathologist of the relationship and what was going on. And when he did look into the skull, he found that his sinus cavities and whatnot were collapsed, and that his petechia that he had on his face and body showed that he had died from suffocation.
After Jason's death, Kelly starts to speak. What's her version of events that she starts to tell police?
Okay, so initially her story was that she shot Jason up with heroin that night, and that was his request, and that he died of an overdose. And she basically stuck to that story for a while because, it took a while for the pathologist to release his report. So she did not know during those initial interviews that the detective already knew that Jason, his death was ruled a homicide. So she stuck to that story. The detective allowed her to play the victim, which is what she did. He was abusive, and I was victimized by him, and his death was an accident. And she really played that up for quite some time. The detective realized after some time, and he did, once that pathologist's report came out and he was able to tell her, the pathologist is saying it was a homicide. Again, she stuck to her story. She didn't believe him. And it wasn't until the letter call that the detective presented. And actually, when he presented that idea to me, I did not think it was going to work. He called me and he said, I think that we're going to take, one of their friends and have him make this call. And he's going to tell her that Jason gave him this letter and said, if anything should happen to me, just mail this to the Iron River Police Department. Don't open it. And I really didn't think it was going to work because she was just too smart. She was too ahead of us. So the day came when they were going to set this letter call up, and they were going to use Jason's best friend, who had actually seen Jason for the last time a couple weeks before his death. And he's actually the one that called the tip line after Jason's death. He called the FBI tip line and said he didn't even know about the investigation in Michigan. He knew that they were being looked at for someone's disappearance, but they really didn't know a lot about it, and he believed that. So when Jason died, he called the tip line. He said, I was just with my friend and he was fine. I was talking to him on the phone the night that he died, and he was totally fine, and now he's dead. And I just think there's something wrong, and that, you might need to take a look at his wife. And those were his words. So the detective, Jeremy, reached out to him, presented this idea, and he was totally on board with doing it. So the day that the letter call was going to happen, I was, at work, and the detective, I just said, let me know how it goes. They were going to do the call at like 9:00 in the morning. And I went about my day. I was busy at work, and I looked up at the clock at one point, and it was like 11:00. And I thought, I haven't heard anything. It must have not gone well. So I was kind of like bummed out. And probably 30 minutes later, I get an email from the detective. And all it said was, here's the recording. And the recording was attached to the email. So I play the email recording, expecting that it's just going to be a flop. And when I listened to her answer the phone, and he gives the spiel about Jason had given this letter to him, And as soon as he finished telling her, she just let out this big sigh. And she said, please don't mail it. And right there, I mean, the hair on my arms stood up. I knew we got her. And the reason I knew we got her was because a week before Jason's death, Jason was talking to his brother out in their garage. And he started talking about the death of Chris Regan, or Chris Regan missing. And he was talking about what he did and starting to elaborate on it. And Kelly walked into the garage and caught him talking to his brother about Chris Regan. So a week after that happened, Jason's dead. So when Kelly responded the way she did, she literally broke down on the phone after the letter information was given to her from Jason's friend. And again, asked him, please don't mail it. Please don't mail it. And he basically said, I have to do what he asked me to do. And it was almost like then the light bulb went off in her head. Like, okay, this could be a setup. I might be being tricked or whatever. And then her next response was, you have to do what you have to do. So once that happened, it kind of opened a door for us and for the investigator, the detective, because he felt like he had her, like he now had an opening, he had an in, and things greatly shifted at that point. Suddenly, she wanted to talk to the detective immediately. And immediately, she told him that, in fact, her words were, Chris died quickly. That's the first thing that came out of her mouth. And she said that Jason shot him in the head and, he fell down the basement stairs and he died. So we have now shifted from, I have no idea what could have happened. We had nothing to do with his disappearance, to my husband did it. And he forced me to clean up after he did it. And he forced me to watch, when he cut the body up. And so all of us sitting there knew that that wasn't the case, but we were happy to be getting the information at least we now know that Chris Regan is dead and that he died in their house. So there's a couple things that happened before all of this when the detective started interviewing her. Again, it's that manipulation thing. It's, kind of trying to beat them at their own game. So the detective was talking to her about the search warrants, and the search warrants that we did at her house. There were times where Kelly would call me and say, we're going to sue you. You've ruined our house. We can never come back to it. And all of these times she would call, it was just kind of to feel me out. I think she just was feeling me out to see what we knew and what we found. So in one of the interviews that the detective did with her, he said, explain to me how Chris Regan's blood got on the wall in your house. We didn't have Chris Regan's blood on the wall, but her answer definitely led me to believe that we could have found it. Like it could have been there, because her answer was sometimes he would get nosebleeds. He had sinus issues. And one time he was standing in the house and he sneezed and blood got on the wall. And that was a BS story. But at the same time, it told me there could have been blood in the house. So it's just like, the very first time we did a search warrant at their house in Michigan, they took what they could fit in their truck and they left Michigan to never return. So when I'm speaking to her family member that was confidentially working with me, her family member says, suddenly her and Jason show up in the middle of the night back at my parents' house with their truck loaded down with as much as they could fit. And the family is saying, what's going on? Why are you here? What's happening? And Kelly went on to say, they're investigating us. They think that we had something to do with this guy. We're sick of the cops. They've ruined our house. And he said, my mom asked her, well, are they going to find blood in your house or in your truck? And Kelly's response to them was, well, there was this one time that Chris and I went hiking and he cut his ankle and he was sitting on the back of the truck and got some blood in the truck. And that was her answer. These were all awesome responses from her because it told a story that it was there. And the most amazing thing in the world to me is that because of all of these different responses, we know that it happened in that house, because there were definitely times where I started doubting it, because how can you cut up a person's body and not have one stitch of blood? I didn't just have the Michigan State Police lab personnel there collecting evidence. I had the FBI there. I had the FBI evidence response team from Detroit there for 2 days. And we knew where we should look. We knew what we should be looking for. And these are experts. And guess what? They didn't get anything. So there were a couple things that became evident. The first search warrant that we did in their basement, I remember I was standing there with one of the lab workers, and he and I were looking, around the basement. And I happened to notice up in the rafters in one section of the basement that there was clear plastic hanging from a portion of the ceiling. He and I looked at each other and I said, what do you think that is there for? And we were both kind of like, I don't know, kind of shrugged it off. And then you find these 2 huge rolls of plastic, the kind of plastic that you would put on your windows to winterize them and things like that. And we found out much later in interviews with Detective Ogden that she was a big fan of the show Dexter, which I've never watched. She learned a lot from these things. We learned that she had a college degree in forensics. She went to college for psychology. She had been rehearsing or learning how to commit the perfect murders. And we had no idea that this is what we were dealing with, but it all made sense after, because it's very interesting. She would tell lies and tell truth. She would mix them together. And it was our job to kind of try and figure out and separate the truth from the lies. Like, she'd leave breadcrumbs, and it was like you're following a maze, and, you're going in one direction, and then she'll tell you something to throw you off. And then you got to find your way back. So one of the things she had told the detective in her many stories that she told was that at one point, her husband, Jason, made her use a pair of forceps to try and dig the bullet out of Chris Regan's skull, making it sound like so that it couldn't be traced back to them or whatever. And of course, now we think that was a trophy. But I didn't believe that story. That's ridiculous, right? So after everything is done and said, and I take Kelly, after she's in custody, I take her back to her house. She agrees to go. And we're standing in the kitchen. And one of the deputies that was there collecting evidence for me, he asked me, did you say something about forceps, at one point? And I said, yes. And he pointed, and right next to the sink on the counter was a pair of forceps sitting there. Now, those forceps had been sitting there for all of the searches, all of the evidence collection, everything. And she, looked at me, she said, yeah, there they are. I said, you're telling me that those are the forceps you used to try and dig a bullet out or dig the bullet out of his skull? And she said, yep. And she said, and I never washed them. Well, I thought she was lying, obviously. But of course, we collect the forceps, we send them in to the lab. And those would turn out to be the one piece of evidence that had Chris Regan's DNA.
Interesting, because the evidence, what you were able to get from the searches, and there were multiple searches, and that was sort of sitting there all along. As Kelly is sort of speaking more and more to investigators, she says that her and Jason made something of a blood pact 14 years ago when they married. What did that consist of?
So Kelly claimed that, when her and Jason got married, they had made a pact that if Jason were to cheat on Kelly, that Kelly would kill the woman he's cheating with, or vice versa. If Kelly were to cheat on Jason, that he'd have to kill. And the story switched. There was a time when she said if she cheated on Jason, she'd have to kill the guy she cheated with in front of him. Or if he cheated on her, he'd have to kill the woman in front of her. So that was, something she said. Unknown if it's true. I honestly would believe that it probably was, based on some of the findings, in the basement. One of the findings I came across in their basement was a notebook. It was more like a book. It was like a book that Jason Cochran was writing. And in this book had 12 to 15 chapters. And of course, each chapter is titled differently. But the one chapter that drew my attention the most, I think at the time, because it was so fitting, was a chapter that basically described your partner having an affair. He talks about being at a cookout at the neighbors and seeing a vehicle drive, into the driveway or into the residence. He talks, about the hunter becoming the hunted. He talks about a sign above the door saying, do not enter, you weren't invited, something along those lines. So this whole chapter in particular, in my opinion, could have described the last night of Chris Regan's life. So a very dark couple. And Jason was a very dark person, but Jason became overwhelmed with voices. His mind was going. And especially after what happened with Chris Regan, because I think that I was one of those investigators that wasn't going to let it go. And Kelly kept thinking, she's never going to continue investigating this. We're gone. She's never going to find us. She's never going to catch us because they've never been caught before. And just in my last interaction with Kelly and Jason, which probably was just maybe 3 or 4 months before his death, I had gone to Indiana to collect their DNA. And he was very shocked when I walked into the interview room and he saw me. And I had purposely kept his phone outside of the interview room. And while he sat in there alone for a little while, I went through the phone and I could see his text messages to Kelly that he was having a very difficult time psychologically. He did not want to go to jail. He thought he was going to go to jail. He was falling apart. Kelly knew it. He was basically an anchor around her ankle. And it was just a matter of time before she had to get rid of him.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Laura Frizzo, former police chief of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, who investigated a missing person and uncovered an alleged female serial killer. Who do you think was actually the mastermind behind these crimes? Because if they did it together, there are descriptions of Jason potentially being a little bit more weak and not being able to, in those interviews, lie quite as easily as Kelly could. Who do you think decided that this is what they would do? Do you think there was a leader, or do you think that they worked more so, really as a pair?
No, I think she was definitely the mastermind. And that isn't just an opinion based on my intuition or anything else. This is based on, again, my history of getting to know them through their own messages to each other, their own interactions that I was, able to go back. I was able to go back and look at conversations between them that went back to 2012. So I saw a history of how she treated him and how he responded to her. He was very troubled. He didn't like his wife having affairs. She did it on a regular basis. He was constantly pleading with her to stop. And she knew how to play him. She's a very sick individual, and she would push him to his limit over and over again. His participation in the death of Chris Regan, I believe that this was a huge turn on for her. This was, I guess it's hard to explain other than saying, serial killers, if you research them, have the same kind of euphoria when they're able to kill somebody. And, they're okay for a while. And then it's almost like something pulling at them because they desire to do that again. And that's how it was for her. But she didn't want to get caught, and she was smart enough to know how to use Jason. Like I said, little things she was doing all along to basically set him up in case something happened and they got caught, so that she could relieve herself of the situation. So leading up to Chris's death, Jason was continuously sending messages pleading with her, please come home, please be my wife, please stop cheating on me, I'm losing my mind, those kinds of things. And then all of a sudden, October 14th comes around and Chris is killed, and the messages are stopped for a day or so. And then on October 16th, Kelly's in love with her husband again. And she's really pouring it on. Like, you're the most handsome man I've ever known, and I love you so much. One message she had sent him, she was at a doctor's appointment or something, and she had sent him a message saying, I just got done, I'll be on my way. And she referred to him as handsome, showing that kind of attention that she never did. This was, again, very mentally abusive situation. And she said, I'm going to be on my way home. I want you to cook me breakfast, and I want you to have sex with me, but, more explicit. So Jason's basically responded by saying, you better love me. And it was just a very apparent that she lured Chris Regan there. Jason is most likely the one that shot him. And participated in cleanup and getting rid of the body. And that was what she needed. That was her fix. So she was the dominant one. She was basically told him what to do and he did it.
How many people do you think that Kelly and Jason were responsible for killing?
Again, it's the breadcrumbs. There was a time where she made a list and it was like 21 people. I believe, and the detective also that got to know her very, very intimately, it could be anywhere between 5 and 10 based on the history that we know, the work they did, and just, our encounters with people that have known them. She literally tried to kill a woman that she was having an affair with in Indiana as well. We know that just because the detective got to know this woman through the investigation. So I think when Kelly and I spent the day together and she was showing me various locations, like where the body was placed, where the gun was placed, we had a conversation. And during the conversation, I asked her a couple of questions, one of them being about Jason. How long did it take to suffocate him from the time you placed your hand over his nose and mouth till he stopped breathing? And she said less than 30 seconds. And I asked her, how do you choose your victims? And she answered me by saying opportunity. And Chris Regan was the opportunity for her. I mean, she knew he didn't have any family in the area. Nobody really knew him. He was new to the area, and that no one would even realize he was missing for days, that would give them enough time to take care of what they needed to. So it wasn't too long ago, actually, that Jeremy and I visited Kelly in prison. And the reason that we went to visit her was because about a year and a half ago, we received a letter in the mail. And Jeremy and I have been living together for 3.5 years now. I'm sure that someone has told Kelly that, who knows what connection she has to the outside world. But the letter came addressed to Jeremy and Laura Ogden, obviously making it sound like she thinks we're married or whatever. How she got the address, who knows? I'm sure someone from outside provided that. I'm not quite sure. But in her letter, she wanted to start this game again. She suggested that if we were able to help her be moved to a federal institution instead of a state prison, that she would give us more victims. So it took some time in talking with prosecutors and whatnot regarding, is this a possibility? Can we go to her and present, you give us information and it is found to be accurate and we can prove that, there's other victims and we've established who they are and that you're responsible for them. Can we tell her, can we, work it out so she's moved? And so once we had that all figured out, we made the trip and went to see her in prison. When we got to the prison and we spoke with her, it became evident that she believed that for each victim she gave us, we would give her another favor. And Jeremy basically told her that it's not happening. This is a one-time deal. You can tell us so that we can provide closure to these other families, and you'll get your wish to be moved to a federal prison, or we're done here. And it was basically left at that.
Finally, I wanted to ask, so Kelly is currently in prison and she's obviously faced a courtroom over her crimes against Chris, but also Jason. What was she sentenced to? Is she in prison for the rest of her life?
Yes, Michigan, she got life in prison without the chance of parole, which she has tried to appeal, but her appeal was denied. Will she continue to appeal? Probably. Indiana, she appeared there for her sentencing about a year after she was sentenced in Michigan. And she was to be given life also in Indiana. But this is, again, based on her saying that she has more victims out there that she wants to divulge at some point. And because we thought it was best to give her this deal that she wanted, thinking that, she would provide these victims in the future. The judge was not happy about it, but he did comply. So she was given 65 years or something in Indiana, but the deal was if she were to confess to additional murders in Indiana, she could not be given the death penalty. And so that's what happened.
Laura, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, Laura Frizzo. You can find a link to the docu-series Dead North streaming on Investigation Discovery in the show notes of today's episode. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our audio producer is Ian Camilleri and our executive producer is Zoe Ferguson. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.